right, and I see that we are at the 11 o'clock hour, so I am going to stop right there, and I am going to invite Jack McCarthy, the Vice Chair for Compassionate Ottawa, to bring words of welcome.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the fourth event in Compassionate Ottawa's series of conversations with leaders. Bonjour et bienvenue à la quatrième rencontre dans la série de conversations avec les dirigeants de Compassion Ottawa. Je suis Jack McCarthy, vice-président du conseil d'administration de Compassion Ottawa. J'aimerais vous parler un peu de qui nous sommes. So my name is Jack McCarthy, and I am the vice chair of Compassionate Ottawa. I'd like to take a moment to tell you a bit about what we are all about. Compassion Ottawa is a community movement that works to change the way we think about living well, dying, death, and grief, and to strengthen the capacity of people to care for each other in times of serious illness and loss. We passionately believe that everyone should have the opportunity to enjoy wellness and self-respect until the end of life. But as we all know, there is discomfort around end of life, death, and grief. That discomfort isolates people as well as those caring for them. We help communities to help people deal with dying, death, and grief. At Compassionate Ottawa, we encourage people of all ages and backgrounds to have conversations about dying and grieving within their families, social networks, places of faith, workplaces, as well as educational and healthcare settings. We offer workshops, hold public events like this one, post relevant articles and research on our website. And we support two amazing projects, a research project, HELP, Healthy End of Life Project, and Caring, Sharing, and Preparing, Let's Talk About Later Life. Both of these amazing projects are aimed at building the capacity of people in Ottawa to ask for and to give help, and to learn more about end-of-life issues. In a nutshell, Compassionate Ottawa, we are a group of community volunteers working in both English and French, and in partnership with others to engage the whole community in caring for one another. It is now my pleasure to introduce CEO volunteer Marion Rattray, who will join in conversation with our featured speaker, Lorraine Wright. Marion is the team lead for Compassionate Ottawa's Grief and Bereavement team. For her entire career, which she has recently retired, Marion was a practicing nurse. The majority of her work was at CHEO, the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, where she held roles as bedside nurse, manager, operations director, and chief nursing officer. Marion developed and provided leadership to the pediatric palliative care program at CHEO and Roger Nielsen House. In 2013, Marion was awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Award. Marion has always been a strong advocate for the need for quality palliative care services. She currently volunteers with bereaved families of Ottawa, in addition to Compassionate Ottawa. Over to you, Marion.
Thank you very much, Jack, for that lovely introduction. And I have to say, I just so admire your passion around this work. It's fabulous to be on a team with you. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Lorraine Wright. Dr. Lorraine Wright is Professor Emeritus of Nursing, University of Calgary. She is also an international lecturer, author, blogger, and actively practices as a consultant and therapist. Lorraine has spoken nationally and internationally at spiritual care, family nursing, family therapy, chronic illness, oncology, and palliative care conferences, workshops, universities, and hospitals. Lorraine was awarded honorary doctorates from the University of Montreal in 2008 and from Linnaeus University, Sweden in 2012. In 2013, she was awarded the Distinguished Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal in Canada. Just this past year, 2020, she was awarded the prestigious Lifetime Achievement Award by the College and Association of Registered Nurses in Alberta, Canada. Lorraine is the author of 12 books and numerous chapters and articles. Her most recent book, Suffering and Spirituality, which is the touchstone to our talk today. Suffering and Spirituality, The Path to Illness Healing, which I have a copy here and is available on Amazon. And here it is. And I have to say, what I'm happy with the most about this book, it's got nice big print. That made my day, actually. So a big welcome to you, Lorraine, and thank you for joining me in this conversation.
Well, thank you, Marion. It's great to be with you this morning. I have to admit, I didn't know about Compassionate Ottawa until you invited me. And now I'm just so impressed with all the work and the service and the contributions you folks do in your community, and that so many of you are volunteers. So it was very impressive, and I'm very appreciative of all the people that have registered this morning. So I hope that we won't cause them any undue suffering when we talk about suffering and spirituality today.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. And to all of our participants, thank you so much et bienvenue à tous. Je suis content que vous avez décidé d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. So, Lorraine, I think to begin, it would be a good idea. We all know that suffering is part of being human. Nobody gets away scot-free.
No.
So what is your way of thinking about suffering?
Well, I like what you said right at the first, that nobody gets away. You know, the thing about suffering, though, it isn't really dished out in a fair manner, at least from a lot of us, our perspective, right? It seems some people have to endure more suffering than others, but nobody escapes it. And if I could just tell a quick little story, these ideas pop into my head, but it really came home to me one time when I was meeting with a group of mental health nurses in Alberta. And I was saying just what you said, you know, nobody gets away with suffering. Everybody has to experience it sometime in life. But there was a young woman, she was 25 years old, put up her hand and said, I have not experienced suffering. And so everybody looked at her and said, it will come. But she said, no, I can't say I've had any major suffering in my life. And she said, I guess because I'm young. And another young woman beside her, another lovely mental health nurse, who was 23 years old, she said, I know all about suffering. I experienced the loss of my mother at 10 years old. She said, I had to deal with a major loss, a major suffering in my life, very young. So suffering doesn't spare any of us. Sometimes it comes to us very young. Sometimes people escape it until they're much older. And sometimes it comes in waves. I know in my own life, it's like it comes in waves and then you get a little holiday from suffering, right? But what do we mean by suffering? I mean, we think about it in so many different ways. Some of us will think we suffer if we don't have our morning coffee, right? We talk about suffering, you know, around small things a lot of times. And in this COVID world, a lot of us have talked about suffering from minor things about not being able to go eat in a restaurant, to major things of having a family member be very ill and not able to visit with them. So we have the whole range. But what I have found in my practice and working with others is the suffering that most of us experience is suffering that comes and goes and doesn't change our life or relationships. And even sometimes with serious illness. And I can give a personal example. About 15 years ago, I had my one and only brush with cancer, and I had surgery, and I went on with my life, and here I am today. I've never had a recurrence. I feel great. It didn't change my life or relationships. So when I think about suffering, at least the kind of suffering that I most often meet with the families whom I've worked with over the years and continue to, is what I call deep suffering. And deep suffering to me is the kind that changes your life and your relationships forever. It's the kind of suffering that we experience with a serious illness, where your life is not going to be able to be the same, or it's a loss, by divorce or by death, or it's a disability that you've had because of a car accident and your life will not be what it was. Or it can be, heartache and heartbreak of changes in relationships that you can't return to what life once was. So this is the kind of suffering that I think about because, and it's what I call deep suffering, because it's the deep suffering that I mostly encounter in my practice and that I've experienced in my own life. And the kind of, I feel, where we as humans can really be helpful to each other, and as healthcare professionals can be helpful to each other. So I do make that distinction between suffering that comes and goes but doesn't change our life and relationships, as opposed to suffering that we encounter and it does change our life and our relationships forever. That life will never be what it once was. Yes.
And I think too that in speaking of deep suffering, and obviously my work is volunteer work is around
Yes.
grief and loss.
Yes.
And certainly grief can create deep, deep suffering. And unless people get the support that they need and are given hope that they will get through this, it can affect the rest of their life.
Yes.
And particularly with children. I mean, our children should not die before we do. It is totally against the laws of nature. And I have seen parents that have just been totally devastated for a great length of time. And that is why I am such a promoter of help during grief and loss.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Anyway, were you going to say more, Marion?
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
So we talk about beliefs. Like my personal belief is whenever something happens to me like you, Lorraine, had breast cancer. I thought that my belief was that I had that because I was supposed to learn something. My second child, right after being born, ended up in neonates at CHEO, and that was truly suffering. I was so frightened over what was going to be the outcome. And my belief, once again, was that I was to learn something, and what I learned was that when your child is ill, you're neurotic. And if you think they're not going to live, you're totally psychotic. Like you're just, the suffering is huge. Mm-hmm. So that helped me work with the parents that I dealt with in my practice.
Yes.
And I think too, to try and I'd like to enforce the fact right now that it's not just healthcare professionals that can help one another.
Yes.
It is each and every one of us, the Mrs. Jones next door. Mm-hmm. When Mr. Smith dies, how can Mrs. Jones help her get through this? So could we talk a little bit about beliefs and spirituality and suffering and how they're interconnected?
Well, this was one of those big aha learning moments I had a few years ago. My colleagues and I at the University of Calgary had operated a family nursing unit, an outpatient clinic, for some 20, 25 years. And we saw many families there who came and were suffering with serious illness or loss. And one of the things that we began to realize, we did some research around illness beliefs. And one of the things I began to realize that what people believe about the illness, about their family member, can either enhance or soften their suffering. And so that became really an area that I was fascinated with and wanted to learn more about. And it's true in our own life, isn't it? If you believe I had a family say to me once that had Crohn's disease, they said, we're the best family to have had this disease because we're strong and we can manage. But other families will have different beliefs about it. They, especially like you were giving the example, Marion, if it's with a child, okay? They will ask themselves, you know, why is this happening to my child? You know, what have I done? I haven't been a bad mother. And one family that I saw in Thailand, it was a beautiful experience. I went with this is one of the privileges I've had of lecturing in different places in the world, but I went with this colleague of mine and her nursing students. They were doing outpatient, you know, seeing families in the home. And so we went to this family where the father had had a brain aneurysm and was now paralyzed on one side. And these lovely nursing students had been working with him. And they had, you know, the mother, when I met with them, this was on their last meeting with the family, when I asked the family, how do you understand that this happened to your husband? And the wife said, at first, I didn't understand why it was, because he has not been a bad person. He didn't have bad karma. Okay? In the Buddhist tradition of thinking about, did he have bad karma or not? And it was an amazing, beautiful story. And one of the most amazing things, because he was aphakic, he could only speak one word. And the one word that he spoke in Thai was healing. Isn't that incredible? The only word he spoke. And so these wonderful Thai nurses, these nursing students worked with him, because when they met him, he was only lying on the couch. He was not getting up. He was not participating in any activities anymore with his children. He was sad. He was depressed. He was suffering. And this whole family, that was a mother and a father and the grandma and two sons. So these lovely young nursing students engaged the young boys to start walking with him and started to help him practice his walking. The mother had to go out to work because he was no longer able to work. He was in his 40s. And he made tremendous progress, and so did the grandmother. But when I met them at the end, they asked me this question: do you think that he is going to be healed? Because this was his word, healing, right? And so I asked them, do you think he's made any progress in his healing? And they said, yes, we think he has. And I said, well, so I shared one of my beliefs. And I said, well, you know, I believe that love can be healing. And I have experienced so much love in your family today, and the way that you care for him. I said, I don't know if he'll be able to ever work again, or be able to, you know, walk, have better mobility, but I do know that he is healing. There's more peacefulness from what you describe in your family, and that I really believe that love is healing. And so when I was about to leave the family, they asked if we could have a picture together. So I sat with the family, and the grandmother took my hand and held my hand through the whole, you know, while we were taking photos, and with me and the family and the nursing students. And when we got back into the van afterward, I was traveling back to the university with the students. They said to me, why did she hold your hand? Why do you think she took your hand? And I said, because we fell in love. For that moment, for that couple of hours that I was with that family, I loved that family, and that family loved me back. And because I commended them for the love in the family, because I operated with a facilitating belief that I have, that love and support, and we know there's all kinds of research around this, that social support is one of the most beneficial things about, you know, about healing, about family members feeling supported, that because of sharing that belief that I had, it touched the family. Okay? And they gave me the gift back of touching me. Okay? And the grandmother holding my hand. It was you can tell I'm still touched by that beautiful experience that I had with that Thai family. Yes. So that's my long-winded answer to your about times when is it appropriate to share our own beliefs, and other times it is not. Okay? If you think it's going to get in the way of the family, we're not there to convince family members about our particular beliefs, whether it's with friends or clients. But if you think it can be helpful, and in that particular instance, I thought it might be helpful for that family, and it was. Yeah.
And I think it's important to mention too that compassion and helping others, and it's very obvious in how you're speaking today, Lorraine, that improves one's own health and well-being. And research has demonstrated that it improves our immune function.
Yes, yes.
So there's benefits on both sides.
Yes.
And when you speak about healing, I think about families that I have worked with and their child is dying, and the incredible, obvious, deep suffering. Why is this happening to us, as you mentioned?
Mm-hmm.
How will I ever live without this child? There's a time when suddenly there's peace. And in my work, I always look forward to those times, because very often parents would then stop thinking or being on the internet and looking for that cure, something else. Could we go to the States, whatever? And it's that acceptance, not of the disease, but of the situation that I think is the healing. And then they were able to be totally present with their child. Mm-hmm. And stop this business of doing 2 instead of doing 4.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, very much. I agree. Mm-hmm.
So
Can I
let's
just add to some? Oh, I'm
Yes.
sorry. Were you going to?
No, that's okay. No,
you just triggered something for me, and that is when I'm often asked, and it was, in the title of my book about, the path to illness healing. How does healing occur? And one of the great lessons I've learned, and this was through some, research we did within our clinic, was that when there's deep suffering, it needs to be acknowledged. In order for any healing to occur, you have to acknowledge that there is deep suffering. And I think it's one of the things that we run away from oftentimes as friends or family members or healthcare professionals. And we fall into the trap, at least in North America, of the cheer up phenomena. Okay? If somebody's suffering, we want to cheer them up. We say all kinds of things sometimes that are not helpful at all. Okay? That, it could be worse. Think about other families. At least you have your child. At least you have your husband still. We say many goofy kinds of things, trying to be helpful because of this cheer up phenomena. Why? Because I believe it is so difficult to witness suffering, to really stay with suffering and to witness it. So a few years ago in our clinic, we did a study looking at suffering conversations. So every family in our clinic was videotaped. And so we looked to examine and look at the videotapes of families where we felt there was really deep suffering, and to see what we did and what we didn't do, right, that was useful, and to compare it to what the families said about our work after we finished with them. Because we would send out a questionnaire 6 months after our work and ask them, were we helpful or not? And here's what we learned. Families who said that we were helpful were families who said we acknowledged their suffering. If we didn't acknowledge their suffering, then what did they say? That clinical team didn't even get it. That nurse didn't even understand. So many of the families said to us, one gentleman that I remember vividly, who was a young man with MS. And when I validated his suffering, when I said to him, this is a tragedy what's happened to you. This is very sad. You're a young man in the prime of your life. And he said, I'm so glad to hear you say that. I'm tired of being told that I'm strong and that I'm coping so well. And this is an amazing phenomena, I find, that when you acknowledge somebody's suffering, When you say this is really an awful thing that you're going through, this is really a difficult time, this is a real tragedy that's happened to you and to your family. When you do that, okay, when you offer those kinds of comments and you validate their experience, okay, it's just amazing how you open the door to healing. It's like a paradoxical intervention, okay, that you offer, you acknowledge the suffering, and it begins to open the door. And why does it open the door to healing? Because talking is healing. Okay? And we are caught up, unfortunately, like I said, in this cheer up phenomena and the happiness industry that we have in North America. If you want to go on to Mr. Google and Google happiness books, you can find hundreds of them, hundreds of courses and ways to tell us how to be happy, which then makes it even more difficult for people who are suffering. And then we fall into the other trap of what? Of saying to people about what we call now the bright siding of illness, that families have to be strong, they have to be coping well, they have to, and they can't complain. We act as that's the gold standard now. If somebody's really ill, we marvel, oh, you know what? They never complain. Well, maybe they never complain because they've never been given permission to share their suffering. And so I find when families are suffering, if you acknowledge that suffering, then they can begin to move on, okay, through this amazing thing that I witness that happens, that once the suffering is acknowledged, then you can begin to offer hope and healing. But if you offer hope and healing before there's acknowledgement of the suffering, family members feel that you don't get it. You don't understand. Yeah.
And it takes great courage to approach someone
Yes.
around us. It doesn't come easily to anybody, even healthcare professionals. And I think too that healthcare professionals automatically, when you hear suffering, they think of physical pain.
Yes.
It's not something that's reinforced. It's not in the care plans.
Yeah. No, that's really true.
I think too, your comment about acknowledging the suffering. I remember a physician that I worked with, and I could just see the people kind of sink into their chairs when he would say, I can only imagine how difficult this is for you right now.
Mm-hmm.
So moving on a bit, Lorraine, we know that suffering affects the entire family.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll never forget the child's mobile that was in the family system program.
Yes.
That struck me forever. How when one piece of the family's of the mobile is moved by a breeze, the rest of it moves too. And also the fact that the person that's suffering the most is not always the person with the illness.
Mm-hmm.
An example that I can give: if you have someone in the family, a husband with a heart condition, and you're the wife and are witnessing not eating properly, not exercising, working like crazy, she's suffering more than he is.
Mm-hmm.
He's living his life. So I wonder if we could talk a little bit about how illness affects the entire family and how the family's beliefs have an impact on this and how they cope.
Right. Well, you've touched on something that's another great learning I've had, and it's just simply by asking this question of families that I've worked with is, who in the family is suffering the most? And when I ask that question, I haven't done any research on this particular question, but I would guess that at least 80% of the time, it's not the person with the illness diagnosis. Now, oftentimes in the beginning of an illness, we can think that there's a lot of suffering by the person, you know, especially if they're adjusting to a life-threatening diagnosis or, well, I can give you the example of my own mother. My mother was diagnosed with MS in the last few years of her life. It was a terrible, debilitating illness. And at first, my mother suffered a lot, emotionally and spiritually. But not as much physically. But in the last year of her life, my mother was bedridden. She was no longer able to walk or to feed herself or to scratch her nose. But my mother was not suffering anymore emotionally or spiritually. She suffered terribly physically. She was completely bedridden, but not emotionally or spiritually. But we were, as a family, we were suffering terribly, and witnessing this decline of my mother over 5 years was a terrible thing to witness. And many times when I would leave the university and go and visit my mother and ask her, and I would get ready to tell her about my terrible day at the university and a difficult committee meeting and, whine to her about my little bits of suffering. And then I would ask my mother, so what kind of a day have you had? And she would say, I've had a wonderful day. And I would say, how could she possibly be having a wonderful day with all that suffering? But my mother had done what you touched on, Marion, and that is she was living now in the present moment. She was no longer wishing what her life had been or what it might be. And when I would go in, she would say, now look at the birds out the window. If I would call to say I'm coming, she would say, oh, could you wait till after Jeopardy? Because your father and I are busy watching Jeopardy. But the suffering for us, and as I would visit with my mother, there were so many times that I would drive away and drive back to my home in tears. And wondering and asking those questions when I haven't really answered your question fully from a while ago, I'm realizing, about the connection from suffering to spirituality, but it raised the big questions in life for me. What are we supposed to be learning from this, if anything? Why does my mother continue to suffer? And yet I had to remind myself that my mother wasn't suffering emotionally or spiritually anymore. I was. My brother was. My sister-in-law, my father. It's very, very difficult to witness suffering in a loved one, in a family member. And so those big questions in life, suffering draws us, deep suffering draws us into the big questions of life about why is this happening to me? What have I done to deserve this? All these questions we ask. And yet I've met many families, I'm even amongst my own friendship circle, when horrible illness, life-threatening illness has happened to them, they will ask this question, why not me? Why not me? Why should someone else, am I saying why me and then someone else deserves it more than me? But this is not an easy place to get to, to ask the why not me. And my mother suffered when we moved, my mother and father moved to Calgary from Winnipeg so that we could be more available to them and care for them. And I asked my mother one day, because I felt badly that, we had moved them from there from their home and their friends. And I said to my mother, so do you miss your friends? And she said, no, Lorraine, I miss my life. I miss my life. But my mother moved past that. Amazingly, she was able to move past that and to live fully present in the moment. And how could she do that? How could she do that? This is the key. And I have to say, I'm very grateful to, you pick up you learn, the most learning I've done has absolutely been from the families with whom I've worked and my own personal life experiences. But of course, I've learned a lot from the research and the literature and my own research. And I'm also have learned this concept from Eckhart Tolle that I'm very grateful for. And I've used it in my practice and in my own life. And that is to not resist what is. That the more we resist what is, the more we suffer. And it's a beautiful concept. And you touched on it earlier too, Marion, about coming to accept what is. And it doesn't mean that you accept the condition that you have. It doesn't mean you have to accept the illness, but it means to accept the situation that you are in. And this, to me, is when healing really begins, when you're no longer wishing for your life in the past, because we suffer with that, don't we? Things will never be the same. As one woman that I worked with MS, and her young boy was kicking the wheelchair, and because he couldn't swim with his mother anymore and do activities with her. But when you come to accept what is, the facts of the situation, and not resist or want to go back to life before you were in a wheelchair, or you're not wondering, it's not fair that I'm not going to be able to live a life, like I used to in the future. But when you focus more on this present moment, as my mother was able to do, as many patients and friends and family have been able to do, and you accept the condition of your life at this moment, there is no suffering. It's an incredible thing. It's truly becomes quite awe-inspiring, and I've seen it many, many times.
So how can we as community people help our neighbor next door to get there? It's transcendence. How do we do that?
Well, there's so many. Where do I begin with this? I'm a real believer of that talking is healing. And when we have friends and family who are suffering, I believe the greatest gift that we can give them, is listening, is generous listening, is what I call being behind your eyes, to be fully present. I mean, we all have those wonderful friends that we know that they're, when we are sharing something exciting with them, or something, sad, that they're fully present with you. And then we know other friends, sometimes you're talking to them and they're not there, and you want to go, hello, New York, hello, are you with me? Okay? But that is really the gift we give them. And there's so many gifts that we can do. Okay? I don't cook, as my friends and family will attest. It's not my strong suit at all. It's not something I enjoy doing. And so I'm not a person that will bring casseroles to the door, or I can pick up food. I'm good at that, picking up takeouts and taking it to people, but I'm not good at making a casserole. But I find that we fall into this trap of asking people who are really suffering what we can do for them, or just give me a call if you need anything. And I find instead of doing that, it's hard for people that are suffering sometimes. I have to say, when friends or family would ask me that, when my mother was dying, when my father was dying, I didn't know what I wanted. I just knew that I felt horrible. But friends would do, I really appreciated friends that did something. You can phone, you can send flowers, you can write a poem, you can send, you can send a book to read. I mean, I think these are the small things, so many things that we can do, but to do something. And I remember a beautiful story that one of the families I worked with told me, that their family member had died, the father in the family. And I was working with this young family who were experiencing the loss of this grandfather in the home terribly. And I asked them, what are friends and family doing that are helpful to you? And he said to me, one of the most helpful things was that a friend came over and polished my shoes so that he would have shiny shoes for his father's funeral. So it's doing something. Sometimes, yes, people are able to say, what would help me is if you could do such and such. But more often when you're in the throes of deep suffering, just having kindness and compassion, having love shown to you, can be a tremendous healer.
That makes me think of a mom that I worked with when she had a son that was ventilated and never would come off the ventilator. That was his life. And her husband died. And in speaking to her one day, she said, I'm so tired of people saying, what do you need? What can I do? She said, I just want them to do it. I don't know what I need. And the other thing is that people, and I think in our society, have a really difficult time asking for help.
Mm-hmm.
It's, we've really gotten away from this. And I mean, our grandparents, great-grandparents were so good at this. They just did.
Mm-hmm.
They just did for other people. So if we could move on a little bit to grief and loss and how we can help the people that are suffering so deeply when they've lost a loved one. I know that acknowledgement is huge, and also the listening. I can't stress that enough, how just sitting quietly, not interrupting, not offering solutions, and the good old things could be worse, or at least you have other children when this poor woman has lost her baby. It's just not helpful, but that listening and fully engaging and listening with your heart. And I think you have to know when to leave too. These people don't have a lot of energy. They're exhausted. Grief is exhausting. It's crazy making. And I think little brief visits and even having a cup of coffee and sitting in the garden and watching the birds is so beneficial. Can you think of anything else, Lorraine?
Well, it really, I mean, in my experience, it really depends on the family, right? And it depends on how well you know a friend or a family member. So maybe I could just share something that I learned from the passing of a dear friend of mine. And it was a great lesson that I learned, and it helped me a lot to be able to help other families. This was a nursing colleague of mine who, we went through nursing together. Her name is Thelma Midori, and we've been friends for 50 years. We did our nursing together, and even though we didn't live in the same city for many years, we maintained a very close and wonderful friendship. And as fortunate as I was, during the last 2 or 3 years of her life, we'd had a lovely trip together to Thailand. She'd always wanted to go to Japan, where her ancestors were from, and so she joined me in Thailand. And sadly, about just a couple of years after that, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And I tried to be a good supportive friend through that time. She was living in Victoria. I visited her frequently and had many frank conversations. And she taught me a lot about what I could do for her, and also her own self-care, about soothing her own suffering. And she had a wonderful expression where she would say, there's 50 ways to suck your thumb. And she would say, some of my ways of sucking my thumb are having a long bath, listening to beautiful music. Okay? And it was a very difficult loss for me. And I was very honored that her family invited me to give the eulogy at her funeral. And over the next year, after my friend died, I was really grieving and having a very difficult time. And I was trying to understand why, I've lost my parents. I hadn't lost my father at that point, but I'd lost my mother. I'd lost a couple of other dear friends. And this learning came to me about what is it? Why am I grieving and having such a difficult time? And I realized that in our grief, the grief over time isn't as intense, right? It does soften. But what doesn't disappear or go away is the missing. You continue to miss them very much. But what I learned in my missing of Thelma, and what I've learned now with other friends and family, is I missed a part of myself. Because every time you lose a family member or a friend, I have learned that you lose a piece of yourself, because every friend and family member knows you in a way that nobody else does, especially your parents. But Thelma, because of a very long history that we have, when I was with her, she would remember something that you have forgotten about yourself, or tell you an experience or a memory that we had together. I do this now, of course, with friends that I've known for years and years. We reminisce about old times and parties and celebrations we've had together. But it was a great learning. For some reason, I learned that around the passing of my friend Thelma. And I think this is a very important aspect to honor in our grieving for others. To ask the question to each other, not just about the family, what do you miss most about that person? What do you still miss? And I like to say to my friends and family members, how do you want to honor this person in their passing? And there's so many ways that people do that. One friend has established a scholarship in her daughter's name. Other friends will visit the graveside frequently. Other people will, like I do, I like to go to my parents' graveside on Mother's Day or on their birthdays. I like to light a candle for some friends. Right? It all depends. What is it that, but then I like to ask the question, what am I missing about myself with that particular person?
Well,
It's a powerful learning that with each loss, and I'm in that age and stage now where I have lost parents and dear friends, but there's a beautiful thing about honoring their memory, about learning how to honor their memory. Okay? And to me, that's a spiritual practice. How do we honor the memory? And one of the most beautiful things that I love is that quote that says, a person never really dies until their name is spoken for the last time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's fascinating to me that there's such interest in family history and genealogy. And in doing so, we are saying the names of our ancestors, perhaps for much longer than we would have if we hadn't have explored our family lines, our ancestry.
And what a way to honor them, the people in our past that truly
I find that a very useful thing in my own life. How do we honor the people in our lives, the friends, the family members that we've been close to? And I always like to ask that in my clinical work with families. How do you plan to honor them? Eh? And what rituals will be helpful to you? Because rituals are so healing. And I'm fascinated, and I wrote a little blog about this on my website about how we are recapturing rituals of mourning that we in North America were they were disappearing. More and more people were saying, I don't want to have a funeral. I don't want to have a celebration of life. I don't want to have any of these things. And yet a family that I worked with not that long ago, the husband, the father had requested no funeral, but the wife and the son said, but he didn't say we couldn't have a gathering in the home and reminisce about him. And so they had a small gathering in their home and invited very close friends, just a small group in this COVID time, and reminisced about him and their memories. There is such a need, it seems, we have as human beings, right, to mourn collectively, to share and support each other in times of grief, and to be there for one another. And so there's so many ways to do that. There's so many ways that we can do that.
And this is a perfect segue, and what you have just said, Lorraine, into this whole issue around COVID. And how people the story that strikes me so much is the lady that was outside the window and saw her mom die in a long-term care home and called the nursing station to say, I think she's gone.
Yeah.
And then not to be able to be present with them. And then not to be able to have the funeral and gather and eat and hug and cry and reminisce. So what do you see is going to happen with all of this? This inability to have our traditional funerals and gatherings. And how can we help people through this?
Well, I've had the experience this past year of attending 2 funerals virtually. And I've also had the privilege of a dear friend here in Calgary when her mother died, that we were able to have a funeral, very limited in terms of numbers. And it was very meaningful. But there are families, for a variety of reasons, that they're not able to have a funeral or a gathering, or they don't want to at this time. They would prefer to wait. And when I've met some of those families or counseled with them, I've offered them the idea to do something, to have some ritual, whether it be, on Zoom together and lighting a candle together, or reading a poem, or reminiscing about the person. Rituals can be so, so healing. And one family that I know has taken up that, and once a month since the mother passed, they get together, okay, and on Zoom, and they light a candle and they reminisce, and which is an honoring of the memory of their mother and grandmother. So I think there are things that we can build in, and it makes me very sad when families say, the person died alone, or nobody was with them. Now, sometimes we know that nurses were with them, but it is really, really shone a light on the significance of us wanting to be able to be with our elders at this time. And in my own family, my dear 98-year-old auntie, who's in Toronto, was admitted to hospital during COVID, not with COVID, but with a broken hip. And then her 2 daughters have not been able to visit with her, only once in a year. But we have this wonderful nurse who does what? Sends pictures to my cousins of my aunt. And what else does she say? This nurse says, "We love your mother. We love your mother." I mean, these are such poignant times for people. And COVID has made it difficult, but it's also aroused in us the significance of family, the significance of friends in times of support. And so I encourage families to invent rituals, invent things that can soften their suffering, that can help with the healing. Because rituals are so very important, whether it's during COVID time or not. Some people will go and I like to go to the graveside of my parents. Other people will go to where their family member is, wherever their ashes have been spread, or there's so many ways, but also the honoring of the person's memory by talking about them.
I think that's a good point, Lorraine. So many, people have said, the parent group that's at work that I facilitated, is they went back to work and nobody said anything. And when she questioned someone about why no one brought it up, they said, "Well, we don't want to make you sad." And her response was, "Well, I don't ever forget that they're gone, but I want you to talk about them, what it was like when they were alive. Like, you're not going to upset me. I know she's dead."
Yes.
So people are so reluctant. They don't want to upset that person.
And even if they are sad to talk about the person, I've had, friends and families and, family members and others tell me that they did, even if it makes them sad, they like to hear about them. They like to talk about them. And I find it's really helpful for family members. And in my own life, I like talking about friends and family that have gone before. And what I find is really lovely too, is if you can talk about the person to a friend or family member about what you appreciated about them, what you enjoyed about them, and about their relationship. To say you were a terrific daughter, you were a wonderful brother. Okay? Yeah. And so sometimes we have to say the words. I mean, I can give another quick personal experience. But this is about acknowledging the suffering. And when nurses and when we meet families that are in a crisis, when there is an imminent death, right, it's just amazing to me how the words of nurses and doctors just stand out. That you hang on every word that they say. And when my father was dying 6-7 years ago in Victoria, and we were gathered at his bedside, we knew it was his last day or a couple of days. The nurses couldn't have been more competent and caring about his physical care. They were tender with him. They would turn him, even though we knew, and, freshen his face, and they would look at us, but they didn't say anything. But they would look at us with very empathic eyes and very lovely. But one nurse, on just a few hours before my father passed, came into the room and washed my father's face, and was taking his vital signs, even though it was very close to the end. But she looked at me and my brother and sister-in-law, my father's wife, and said, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Now that nurse acknowledged our suffering, and it was, I mean, she is one of those angel nurses that I remember. I don't remember any other nurse during those few days that my father was in the hospital, but I remember her. And so we all have in our mind, those paradigm moments, those paradigm nurses, those paradigm friends and family in our minds that help us through difficult times. And will say one sentence or one thing to us that is so comforting. It is potentially so very healing. And so to offer to, help families and friends and families move from suffering to healing, to me, it really is that transformation comes through our listening, through the acknowledgement of the suffering, and then to offer hope and healing. Okay?
And I think too that, and you mentioned it in your book, it really stood out for me how people that are deeply, deeply suffering, they just want to know that they're still cherished.
Yes.
Still cherished and loved, and because all of this suffering is very isolating.
Yeah.
And you add that, COVID, on top of that,
mm-hmm.
It's very, very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So I think our time is nearly up, Lorraine. I can't believe that went so quickly. Yes. I'm just wondering if you have any last points that you would like to make.
Well, I have a very precious story I would love to share.
Okay.
With another friend. Because I learned a lot in this grieving process, in this life-threatening illness with this friend, and also since her passing, which was 3 years ago now. So may I take time just to share that story before we open it up to questions?
Mm-hmm.
So this friend and colleague, her name is Dr. Beverly Anderson. She was a person I worked with 25 years here in Calgary until she and her twin sister, and I have her permission to speak about them today. Her twin sister's name is Arnett, and they both retired out to Victoria. Neither of them had ever married, and they Their 90-some-year-old mother gave them very good advice after they retired and said, why don't you two girls get back together and live together? And so they took their mother's advice and they lived together in Victoria. But unfortunately, after only 4 years, Beverly was diagnosed with bladder cancer. And the prognosis was very poor. This was in 2017. And so in my visits with Beverly, I was amazed how she did not resist what was happening to her. She was surprised by it. She said she never expected to have such a serious illness, but she did not resist it. It was really amazing that she was able to do that. And so Beverly loved rituals. And so I happened, this is about halfway through her illness experience, I happened to be going to Spain to present at a conference, and I wanted to walk the last 100 kilometers of the Camino Frances. Maybe some of you know about the Camino Frances. It used to be a walk of pilgrims, years ago, and they'd walk for religious reasons, but people walk it for all kinds of reasons now, just for the exercise, for some reflection, for the joy of walking in these beautiful areas. So I wanted to walk the last 100 kilometers. So a dear friend of mine, Fabi, she and I walked that last 100 kilometers into Santiago de Compostela. And I had this idea because I knew Bev loved rituals. I thought I would like to dedicate this walk to her. And so I asked her, what would you think about me dedicating this walk to you? Would that be okay? And she said, yes. And I said, then when I'm walking along and we stop in a little village, I can, stop and say a prayer for you, and I'll be thinking about you all the time. And so that is what I did. But before I left, I said to Bev, is there anything that you could give me that I could have as I walk along? And she said, yes, my brother has carved these Norwegian comfort birds, and I'm going to send you one. And so she did. And so I took Sunny the bird. She called it Sunny because she said, I need more sun in my life. And I walked with Sunny the 100 kilometers, and I stopped at these little churches along the way. And it was a very meaningful experience. And I would send Bev on email pictures of Sunny sitting at a table having lunch, Sunny in a chapel. And when I returned home, I went to Victoria to visit Bev to bring back Sunny. And she said, no, I want you to keep Sunny. I want you to travel with Sunny. And so this has been a great gift that she gave me, a great remembrance. And the other thing that I learned from Bev was the importance of rituals, even right to the end when she was in hospital, the last time I visited her, and she was going to be moved from hospital to hospice, but she wanted one more time to come home. And so she asked if she could come home one more time so that she could celebrate her birthday with her twin. And so on that September day, she was brought home from the hospital. But Bev, you have to know Bev, she didn't come home in her hospital gown. She wanted to be dressed up. She had her jewelry on. She had a beautiful outfit on. And she came home, and 3 of their nieces came to visit with them, and they had a birthday celebration. And then she went to hospice. And then she died in hospice a couple of months later. And just yesterday, I had a lovely email from Arnett, who said to me when I was asking her, Arnett, I'm going to be giving this little, conversation tomorrow. Do you have anything that what helped you? And she said, well, the love of friends and family. And then she said, and a quote that you sent me. And I'd forgotten, hey, you do about doing something, hey? And I just like to read you this quote that I sent her, because caregiving, you can imagine the caregiving of your sister is one thing, but this is the caregiving of your twin. And this is the person you have lived your whole life with. And so I sent her this quote, and it says, "My life is not on hold during this intense caregiving phase. This is my life right now, and it's part of my growth as a person." So you never know what people might remember. And I admire so very much Arnett, who has had to go on in her life in a very tough way, grieving the passing of her twin. But she's doing it, but with sadness and great missing. So I tell you this story about the beauty of rituals, the beauty of what our friends and family will give us. And we're transformed. It's not just about, I thought I was doing such an amazing thing for Bev. I'm dedicating this walk to her. But what she did for me and how these experiences transform us.
Well, and I think too that many healthcare providers will say that working with people at end of life and that are experiencing deep suffering, whether it be due to helping someone whose husband has dementia or whatever,
yes,
is that you appreciate yourself, you appreciate life so much more. I call it the attitude of gratitude.
Mm-hmm.
That's the gift. That's the gift.
Yes.
Well, Lorraine, thank you so much. I think we could move on. We should move on to questions. We could talk for the whole day. So thank you very much. So over to you, Paula.
Thank you, Marion, and thank you, both of you, Marion and Lorraine, for this conversation. That's been an absolute delight to listen to, for your personal stories and your wisdom. I know everyone really has been sending some very thankful comments to us in the chat box in regards to that. So we have about 20 to 25 minutes for questions from our audience. Just as a reminder to our participants, if you would like to submit a question at this point for Marion and Lorraine to respond to, time permitting of course, we ask for you to submit it in the Q&A box if you're watching on Zoom, or if you're watching on YouTube Live, you can submit it right in the live chat on the right side of the screen, and we will be monitoring those and asking those questions. So the first question that we have asks, why is it so difficult to sit in the pain with a loved one? I find it easier to do with clients, it's my job, but it's hard to do with my husband. His pain impacts me directly. It hurts me too.
Yes. So do you want to answer that, Marion, or do you want me to? Or
I think I'd like you to answer it, Lorraine.
Okay.
Good.
Well, because it's about an emotional connection, It's about love. Of course, it's much. I'm not saying it's not that it's easy to sit at the feet of clients or family members that are suffering, but it's just a heightened experience when it's with someone that you're married to, or that your son or your daughter or a family member, because of the emotional connection, because of the deep emotional connection. I mean, you can feel close to your clients, but it's a different kind of relationship. There is nothing more difficult, I find, than to witness the suffering of a close family member or friend. It's tough stuff. It is life, but it's not easy. It's very difficult. And we all need to have, what I call who supports the support system. If you are the caregiver, like Arnett was with her sister Bev, it was a very difficult time, but it is exactly what Arnett wanted to be doing. Right? And other friends and family, my dear friend here in Calgary, who cared for her mother in such a devoted and caring way every day for a year, but is what she wanted to be doing. But it doesn't make it easy. Okay? But I find, it's an amazing thing that once a family member or a friend has died that you've been caring for, I experience that I miss caring for them.
It's the loss of a role.
Yes.
Just like with your friend.
Yes.
You lost your role as her friend.
Yeah. Yes. So no, so I didn't catch that person's name, but it is, no, this is a very difficult time to sit, and especially to witness pain. Oh my gosh. To see somebody in pain really, really is tough to watch and to observe. It's very, very difficult.
And I think if we know of someone that is going through that, neighbor, whatever, community person, it's to offer that commendation. You're
Yes.
doing a wonderful job.
Yes.
I can recall families that, I think especially of the children with cerebral palsy, and as they grew to be older, and a lot of them would show up with, often with pneumonia. And oh, those parents were so exhausted from the total care and trying to maintain an income and keep everybody fed and the other children. Just, and if you would find something and to say to them, your child's skin is in such beautiful shape. You've done a great job. It gave them confidence to keep going.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the next question that we have asks, how do we help clients, especially young children, following the sudden death of a parent?
Well, the sudden death, anytime, whether it be with a parent or a child, is one of the more difficult things. Death is never easy, even when we anticipate it for a long time. But when it's a sudden death, it takes a long time for the brain to even process that, to even get our head around it. And when you just think of the tragedies that have been happening in the United States with these terrible shootings, I mean, sudden death is just dreadful. And I find, of course, with children, you have to think about what is the developmental stage of that child. How you're going to comfort them if they're a teenager is very different than if they're just, 5 or 6 years old. But I have found in my practice that what helps children the most, especially the younger they are, that they're going to be cared for, especially if they're in a single parent family. And I remember one family that I worked with, the child, the mother had died, and the child's biggest concern was, not about that the mother had died, but who was going to look after her, who was going to be with her. Now, she was temporarily with an aunt that eventually adopted her, but you have to really think about the developmental stage of the child and then how you're going to help them. And younger children, they need to know that they'll be looked after. And another family that I worked with, of course, when the mother died, the child then I met the family a couple of years after the mother had passed away. And this child was very anxious that the father would become ill and that she would lose her father. And so we had to work on that in terms of, what was triggering this anxiety and these fears. And then with older children, we know that they need to be able to have opportunities to talk about it, to talk about the loss of their parent, to talk about their anger around it, or their sadness, or their guilt around it, or whatever it may be. But sudden death is a really tough one, really, really difficult. And it takes oftentimes many months or years to be able to really put that in its place in your life, and how you respond to that. I can tell just a quick story, a clinical story of two sisters. Well, it was a sister and her husband that I met, and I met them, it must have been, I'm going back a bit, I think it was at least 5 years after her older sister had death by suicide. And she was an older woman. She was not a young woman when she had taken her own life. She was, if my memory serves me correctly, she was at least late 60s. And this sister was still 5 years later feeling so guilty, so blaming of herself. And why? Because the sister had come to live with them. She had suffered depression throughout her life, and she came to live with them. And sadly, she took her life while she was living with her sister and her husband. And here was this, poor woman suffering so much. But I tried to offer them another idea that they found very useful. And I said to them, I wonder if your sister came to live with you because she knew that she would be cared for and loved, even if she had to take her life to end this pain. And I'm wondering how you could honor her in a different way. Rather than feeling guilty and sad, maybe she honored you. Maybe she honored you to be the one that she felt comfortable enough to be in your home and to end her psychological pain. Now, the sister told me she found that very, very helpful. That it was a way of, she said, you're right, I have never taken time to honor my sister. I'm so absorbed in my own guilt and my own suffering, my own grief. So it was a potent story, but sudden death by any situation is a really, really difficult thing. Very tough and very difficult to heal from. It takes a long time and a lot of support and a lot of comforting. Yeah.
So the next question that we have says, so much of our language around illness is the image of a battle, cancer especially. How do you not resist when the culture around us wants to see it as a win-lose fight?
Oh, that's such a great one. I know. And especially with cancer, we're always saying, I'm going to beat that cancer. I'm going to fight that cancer. I'm going to win over this cancer. We don't do that with other illnesses. We don't say, I don't hear people saying about epilepsy that I'm going to get over that. But it unfortunately, that can invite different kinds of blame of the person. If a person has a serious illness and they don't overcome it, and especially, for people who are religious and pray about it, but sometimes they will think, well, maybe I didn't have enough faith. Okay? Maybe I didn't pray hard enough. Maybe my faith isn't enough that I'm not overcoming this illness. And I really don't find those kind of metaphors useful.
I recall a teenager saying to me once when he knew that there was no more active treatment available to him. And he said to me, I feel like such a loser.
Mm-hmm.
Because that had been the language.
Yes. Yeah. No, I found it useful to say to families, do you want to ask them, is this an illness that you want to master, or do you want to learn to live alongside of it? Okay. Or do you want to come to a point of peace with this illness, especially if it's a life-threatening illness? And by peacefulness, it doesn't mean that it simply means that they've come to accept what is. It doesn't mean there's a cure. And I just find that so fascinating in my clinical work, that many times people, especially with a life-threatening illness, people want a cure. But as they get into it more, and as they begin to see that perhaps the prognosis is not going to be that there's a cure, that they let go of the idea of a cure and more want to come to peace with the illness and be able to live with it in the best way that they can.
And that's the healing that you speak of.
That's the healing.
That's the healing. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So our next question says, in your experience, have you found that those who had an established spiritual or religious practice or a conviction of a life after this life were better able or prepared to deal with suffering or grieving?
Well, that is a great question. And you know, the research is really varied on that. If you immerse yourself, like I have, into the literature about spirituality and religion, there are studies there that you can be quite convinced that, oh, if you have a strong religious faith and believe that there is a life after, that you will cope better and differently, right, than people who do not. But I haven't found that this is played out in my experience with families that I've worked with. I've met families who will tell me, when I ask them, are there any spiritual or religious practices that help you during this time? And family members will, you know, I've had families say to me, no, we're not a religious family, and no, I don't think of ourselves as even spiritual, and no, we don't. We like to say that we're atheists. But where I find that you can connect with people is when there's deep suffering. And like I said, it awakens, it puts us into the domain of spirituality. What I find the way you connect is to say, how do you make sense of your life right now? What is the meaning and purpose of your life? Because that is the great spiritual issue in all of this, is that when you have a life-threatening illness or a serious chronic illness, or your life has been changed because of a disability or whatever, how then do you make your life meaningful? What is the meaning and purpose of your life? And when I asked that question to some families, they will say to me, we ask that question every day, because they are searching for, how do we make meaning now? What is the purpose of our life now? And so, do I think it helps some families? Absolutely. If you have a strong faith that there is life after death, that is very helpful to some families. But to other families, even some religious families, it's not helpful, because they think the family member died prematurely, or, you know, they have some constraining beliefs that, you know, this is not fair, this is not right, this shouldn't have happened to our child, this, or to our mother. Okay? As one family said to me, a mother with 3 children, and she said, this is not right that I'm dying, and I have a strong faith, but why would God take me away from my 3 children? So we all have to come to find some meaning and some explanation, and I think it's a real ethical and moral issue, I think, and a challenge for nurses who have worked with all these COVID patients now, trying to make sense and understand the experiences that they've had, not being able to save many elderly people, just as nurses on pediatric units have to come to some understanding about, why do children die before their parents? Why can we not save some children? Even, you know, through faith or prayer or good medicine or science, despite all our best efforts. Okay? And so then families are left to figure out and to answer those questions for themselves, but not for us to take them there. Okay? We have to help family members about, how do you make sense that that mother over there with 3 children lived, but I am not going to be living? These are the big questions of life, eh? And it's spirituality invites us into those big questions. Someone once said to me, you know, spirituality is asking questions. Religion says they have all the answers. It's an interesting distinction.
So the next one that we have says, the word closure has always been problematic to me. What are your thoughts on this?
Do they mean closure with following a death, or?
They didn't specify, but I would assume so.
Yes, and well, we hear that kind of language on the television all the time, don't we? When there's been an accident, or not just an accident, but an illness or something, they'll say, well, the family needs closure. Well, now they've got closure to this. It is not a helpful term to families, I don't find at all, because your relationship with a family member goes on forever. Okay? Because someone dies doesn't mean the relationship ends. It doesn't bring closure. Okay? It brings a new kind of relationship, right? A new way that you're going to have a relationship with this family, with this friend or family member in your life. So I don't find those helpful words. I really think we need to make a list of and put a moratorium on certain words that we will never say with families that are struggling or that are suffering with serious illness or with grief. And one of them is closure. Yeah.
So I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
So this one says, I have been thinking about hospital chaplains and their role in helping patients and their families when faced with these types of suffering, and also in ongoing training with healthcare staff about compassion and spirituality. I was surprised to learn how little they get paid for this work, and yet they provide such an important service. I wonder if there is some way we can improve this. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I don't really have thoughts about. I just know it's a very useful profession. I appreciated very much the hospital chaplain visiting my father and my family while my father, in the last 2 or 3 days of my father's life. But I don't know the circumstances enough of that particular profession. I have given some of my most wonderful workshops that I've offered have been to chaplains because, they deal with deep suffering all the time. Okay? This is usually why they're beckoned to somebody's bedside. And so I've had some wonderful experiences with offering workshops to chaplains because they're eager to learn anything and everything that they might do to soften the suffering of family members and the patients.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Marion and Lorraine, for your responses to these questions. And thank you to everyone that submitted your questions. It's very appreciated. We're reaching the end time of our scheduled session today. So I would like to take this opportunity to invite Jack McCarthy to come back onto the screen to give us some closing remarks.
Wow. I want to thank you, Marion and Lorraine, for an amazing conversation. Like, for me, you kind of opened the door into a deeper, richer understanding of, what deep suffering is all about. And it's really left me thinking in many different ways, from everything from, the cheer up phenomenon, which I sometimes, oh my God, I'm guilty of that, God knows. But to really engage in deep listening and to bear witness and the importance of ritual. Like, again, I'm blessed to have had the opportunity to hear this discussion, and it's going to make me think for quite a while. That it's just how do we deal with, in the best possible way, the deep suffering that we're all going to experience as individuals, and certainly with our loved ones as well. So thank you so much for this rich discussion. And for everybody who's joined us in this discussion as well, I know there was 190 people registered. I don't know exactly how many people who participated, but I want to thank you for being a part of this discussion. I just wanted everybody to know that you'll find on the Compassionate Ottawa website, and of course it will remain on YouTube, this particular discussion, so that you can go back and see it again, or you can tell your friends and others about it by going to the Compassionate Ottawa website. And I want to remind folks or inform folks that our next conversation in this series of conversations with leaders will happen on April the 21st with psychologist Joanne de Montigny, who will share her insights in palliative care. This session will be offered in French, and it will certainly focus on loss and grief, and certainly touch in all areas of palliative care. And watch for more details of that session. Watch for more details coming up on the Compassionate Ottawa website. And please, we encourage everybody to take a minute to complete the survey that will be sent to everyone via email tomorrow who participated in this discussion. We want to hear your views on this morning's conversation, and we'd like to hear what people are looking for future conversations. We really want to get that kind of input. This email that will get sent out to folks will also include resources that may be of use to people, and that really were mentioned or referenced in today's conversation. And also Lorraine's book and your website will make those links as well. So again, thank you so much for an incredibly rich conversation. It was a real pleasure to have.
Well, thank you. I just want to thank Marion again for inviting me and having this lovely conversation with you, Marion. It's really, we haven't seen much of each other for many years, but I really appreciated this opportunity, and thank the people who joined us this morning. I hope it was useful. I hope I didn't enhance any suffering or make it feel like it was suffering having to listen for this long, but I really appreciated the opportunity. And I feel like it's a beautiful way, I think, that we can honor all the learning that we have done. Hey, Marion, I'm sure
Yeah.
all the learning that we have gained from families that we have worked with, families that we have been blessed to know, and how they've enriched our lives. And I think it's a way of honoring them to share these experiences and to talk about them. You know, I mean, there's theory under all of this, of course.
Yeah.
But I like to share some of their stories as a way of honoring the learning and how they've touched our lives for good.
And thank you for those stories.
Yes.
And thank you, Lorraine, for agreeing to do this. I've always said that families are our best teachers. Whenever I would present to student nurses, that would be the first thing that would come out of my mouth, because truly, and I mean, we can have all the theory and everything in the world, but it's our experience and our willingness to be open to learn and change and being flexible. And yeah. So thank you again.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the lovely opportunity.
Okay, I'll throw it back to Paula.
All right, thanks everyone. As Jack said, we will be sending the email out tomorrow that will include a very short survey as well as the resources that Jack mentioned. So thank you so much for your time this morning, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Thank you, Paula.
Thanks, Paula.